Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for January 26th, 2021. Let me begin with some good news. The Executive Intelligence Review and the Schiller Institute will soon be publishing a full expose of the Green New Deal, what it is, what's behind it, and how to defeat it. This is a project, the Green New Deal, which was actually launched in the 1960s by oligarchical interests tied to groups such as the Club of Rome. They put out the Project 1980s for the controlled disintegration of the United States and the world economy. Agenda 2030, all kinds of other projects have come from the same group of oligarchs. And now, having pulled off the coup successfully to get President Trump out of the White House, they now think the path is clear for them to go ahead with this through the Great Reset and the imposition of the Green New Deal. Now, what this really is a policy of primitive energy technologies, replacing modern industry, modern technology with inefficient means which will ensure hunger, collapse of economies, collapse of energy systems, blackouts, and so on, which would end up reducing the world population dramatically, which is precisely the intent of the people behind the Green New Deal, such as the genocidal Malthusian Prince Charles, who's presiding over some of these World Economic Forum events, Klaus Schwab and others, who have argued that the world is overpopulated going back to the 1960s. Now, these new green technologies, so-called, which are really windmills, solar panels, and so on, will be financed by trillions of dollars given to the private banks by the central banks. The private banks will then get this new money and will only loan it to those projects which are approved green projects. This was announced over a year and a half ago at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, by people such as connected to Larry Fink of BlackRock, Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, who's now the guru for the UN on climate. And this is what's being presented at a conference, online conference going on now of the World Economic Forum, presided over by Prince Charles and the Davos billionaires. Now, they're already withdrawing funding of major projects around the world. For example, they're shutting down plans to build modern coal-fired plants in South Africa, Indonesia, and the Philippines. In Kenya, credit was withdrawn from a new rail and port corridor. Ghana was told there'll be no credit for them to build a nuclear plant. In the transatlantic region, it's already very well advanced. In the US, half of coal-powered plants are to be shut down within 5 years. This is as a result of the push from the so-called Beyond Coal project, which is funded by BlackRock and Sir Michael Bloomberg. And this is very well advanced in the United States. And Biden, by the way, is putting the United States back in the Paris Climate Accord. This was rejected by Trump. One of his first acts was to pull the United States out of it because he knew it was fake science and anti-growth. Biden, one of his first acts is to put us back into that. Now, the World Economic Forum has announced that there will be a $30 trillion commitment to green finance. Now, this is just the down payment, but virtually none of it is for Asia or Africa. In fact, they're offering African countries a total of $1 billion to shut down all coal or fossil fuel plants and return only to solar and wind. Now, I've said before, this is not going to work because, first of all, I don't think the population in Western Europe and the United States and Eastern Europe will accept this once they know what it is. That's why we're putting out this report. So you can read it, you can determine for yourself what is the intent behind these policies and what will the result be if they're implemented. But it's already clear that this is rejected by virtually every country in Asia, many Eastern European countries, especially China, Russia, India, South Korea. They're investing heavily in coal and nuclear. I know the Chinese talk about green technology, but they're talking about clean coal and nuclear as clean technologies. China intends by 2050 to have half of its electric power to be produced by coal and the other half by nuclear. The same basic approach is being taken by India and Russia. And they're funding it not by funny money issued by private banks to create a green bubble, but by Hamiltonian national credit, that is, state credit going into the most productive and advanced technologies, which will facilitate continued growth and economic development by providing cheap, clean, reliable energy. In the US, the green technology is funded by money churned from the central banks to the private banks so that they will have investment only in green technologies, creating a green bubble. In the US and Germany, what does this mean? In the future, you're only going to be able to get high-cost electricity, and there'll be blackouts. And the Green New Deal is being pushed through the Congress now by people like Bernie Sanders, who knows nothing about economics, and that illiterate AOC, who sounds like a slightly older version of Greta Thunberg. Now, just as an example of what's going on with other countries, the Argentine president is scheduled to go to China soon to sign a memorandum of understanding for Chinese investment in Argentina, which would then be used to connect corridors from the Atlantic with Argentina to the Pacific with Chile. There's tremendous projects on the boards, many of which Lyndon LaRouche drafted 20, 30, 40 years ago. This is where the future is, not in this phony Green New Deal. And remember, Donald Trump was opposed to the Green New Deal, and getting him out was key for this oligarchical group of fascists to be able to move ahead with these projects. Now, there are a few other matters I just want to touch on. One is the impeachment trial. The bill of impeachment was delivered to the Senate yesterday. It's an absurdity. There's a very interesting op-ed in The Hill yesterday by Rand Paul titled, "Boycott the Sham Impeachment." And he raises the question, he says, to tell a crowd to fight to take back your country, that's now an incitement, considered to be an incitement to commit violence. And Paul goes on to write, if we are to blame politicians for the most violent acts of their craziest supporters, then many of my colleagues would be guilty. And he cited the physical attacks on him and his wife, the shooting of Louisiana Representative Steve Scalise by someone who blamed the Republicans for undercutting Obamacare. And what the implication of what Paul is saying is those who cheered on the so-called peaceful protests, which burned down parts of Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, and other cities, shouldn't they then be held responsible for the arson and violence and the destruction of their supporters? So it's an important question, and what you can see, what Paul calls for is Republican senators to not participate at all in the so-called impeachment trial. Now, a couple of strategic matters on Biden administration policy. It's clear that the administration is going back to a full-scale regime change approach. And the most dangerous of this is with Russia. Now, look, some of this went on under the Trump administration. Pompeo and other idiots insisted on repeated sanctions against Russia, against China, on flimsy pretexts created as false flags by largely the British Empire. So U.S.-Russian relations did not improve significantly under Trump as they could have because of Russiagate and because of these false flags and the sanctions. But it's clear that Biden is going to go back to the Obama policy of pressuring and against these governments and supporting regime change. We see that on the Navalny case, where here you have a phony riot in Moscow that's being hailed as the beginning of the end of Putin. You have the moves on the Nord Stream pipeline, where the British and American interests are saying this must be shut down for the sake of Europe. And there's tremendous pressure. Even though it's virtually finished, it provides ample, cheap, clean energy for 12 different nations of Western Europe. This is now being threatened with sanctions against companies that are building the pipelines and the connection points. And it's another example of using economic sanctions for regime change. We also have tensions in the South China Sea and the Strait of Taiwan, which includes pressure coming from people in the US and from the British to extend NATO into the South Pacific, what they call the Indo-Pacific region, to militarize the area. And what are they doing? They're saying that the Chinese should not have free access to these areas because they're intending to use them to attack other countries, when what in fact is being done by the US in this area? What was Pompeo's plan? To encircle and contain China. Why? Because of anything China was actually doing? No, because the regime changers are targeting China and Russia for the same reason they targeted Trump: opposition to sovereign nations. And as I pointed out earlier, Russia and China are two of the countries that are leading the fight against the insanity of the Green New Deal. The Russians openly, the Chinese in a sort of sly way by saying, oh, we support the ideas of the Green New Deal, but then going ahead and building coal plants, nuclear plants, and investing in infrastructure throughout Africa and Asia. So don't be fooled by this. Don't be fooled by Biden, the idea that Biden is in the hip pocket of the Chinese. Biden is in the hip pocket of the Anglo-American intelligence communities, the corporate cartels who are pushing for the new fascism. And that's not the Chinese policy. That's the policy of the City of London, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. The Chinese are not censoring the American social media. It's the Silicon Valley, which is tied to Wall Street, and the City of London. And finally, we have this absurdity of US troops being sent in to Syria. The President Trump was trying to remove our troops, and actually did remove our troops from northeast Syria. Now under Biden, the day after the inauguration, US troops moved back in to northeast Syria. So we've got to organize opposition to this new fascism. That's what our new report is being produced to do, to give you the material you need to be able to show people the unconstitutional attack on our standard of living, which is tied to this coup against President Trump and against the US Constitution. What's important is no fatalism. The idea that resistance is futile may be fine for a science fiction movie, but when we're defending our republic, the future of our country, the idea that we shouldn't resist, we should wait for the good guys to come in, we should realize that the bad guys are too powerful, that's a policy which is designed to make sure we lose. So no fatalism, get our report, organize with us, join our movement. If you can, go to the LaRouche organization website and make a contribution so that we can get these reports out as massively as possible. We can win this fight, but it's going to take your involvement as active, educated citizens. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again tomorrow.